So it's back and forth. A lot of different harmonies don't combine either of these two passages. Many combine the first passage, woe to Chorazin and Bethsaida, as well as the grateful prayer by Jesus at the end. Some do not combine the woes to Chorazin and Bethsaida, but do combine the grateful prayer of Jesus at the end. And of those, some combine them with Luke and some combine them with Matthew. It's all over the place. I would tend to agree with those that would combine both, but the only thing that would keep me from doing so is this statement, "In that hour Jesus rejoiced in his spirit and said, I thank you, O Father, Lord of heaven and earth," which means that this second statement is only combined with Jesus commending them for their success in spiritual warfare, not the woes to Chorazin and Bethsaida, because that's separated by weeks when they're out ministering. I was about to keep these two second statements separate, the grateful prayer Jesus made, because of this one statement from Matthew. At that time, Jesus answered and said, which means it must be combined with the woes to Chorazin and Bethsaida, or with what happened just before the woes to Chorazin and Bethsaida, when he's responding to the Pharisees questioning about eating and drinking. And he's saying, "You call me a winebibber, a friend of publicans and sinners." It does seem to fit. In fact, that's one of the reasons why I left this here originally, because it fits. They're blinded because they're supposedly so educated, so wise, but the babes, the less educated, the common folk, have the truth revealed to them because they are accepting of Jesus. But then, the answer, I believe, was given to me by the Holy Spirit. I was looking at this passage in Matthew 11:25. Where it says, "At that time Jesus answered and said, I thank you, O Father, Lord of heaven and earth." My eyes focused on this passage. At the beginning of chapter 12, it says, "At that time Jesus went on the Sabbath day through the corn," or the grain, "and his disciples were hungry and began to pluck the ears of corn or grain and to eat." And I know that story does not actually belong here immediately after he is questioned about eating and drinking. Mark and Luke have this much earlier. In fact, all other gospel harmonies that I could find agree that Matthew 12:1 and the following story of his disciples plucking grain and eating them on the Sabbath belongs immediately after Matthew is called. Matthew hosts the meal. He's questioned about fasting. He gives the parable of new wine, new wineskins, old wine, old wineskins. Some of these harmonies include John 5 in between these two events. The parable of new versus old wineskins and the plucking of grain. Those would be the Gospels in Harmony by Lovercheck, Gospel in Life by A.T. Robertson, The Word by Jenkins, The Four Gospels and Four Fonts in One Story by Camolo, and All About Jesus by Roger Kai. They all have Matthew being called, Matthew hosts a meal, Jesus is questioned about fasting, he gives the parable of new versus old wine in wineskins. They all insert John 5 and then follow with the plucking of grain. I think that inserting of John 5 is a mistake, but still they believe that Matthew 12, the story of plucking grain, is supposed to be moved to earlier, after Matthew was called. The Merged Gospels by Crossland does something interesting. He tried to combine the two questions of fasting by moving the arrival of Jairus, him going to heal Jairus' daughter and healing the woman with the issue of blood on the way, into way earlier, so that there was only one question of fasting. But still, he has Matthew being called, the parable of wine and wineskins, some other events, which I think are a mistake, the healing of Jairus' daughter, then the plucking of grain. So clearly he agrees also that Matthew 12 needs to be moved to earlier. The Life of Christ in Stereo did kind of the opposite. It moved the meal that Matthew hosted for Jesus to way later, just before Jairus arrived. Instead of moving Jairus to earlier, where Matthew's hosting the meal, he moves the meal Matthew's hosting to when Jairus arrives. That way, again, the two questions of fasting would seem to be the same. I explained that in more detail in Vlog 64. If he hadn't done that, though, it would have followed with the parable of new versus old wineskins into plucking the grain on the Sabbath day. But still, even with that, he goes from Matthew being called to the plucking of grain. So he also agrees that Matthew 12:1 should be moved to earlier. Two gospel harmonies that agree with how I see it, that Matthew was called, he hosts the meal, Jesus was questioned about fasting, he responds with the parable of the new versus old wineskins, immediately into plucking the grain, are the Chronological Gospels by Michael Rood and the Diatessaron Annotation. So all of them seem to agree that Matthew 12:1, at that time Jesus went on the Sabbath day, doesn't actually mean immediately after what was written before, which is this prayer of gratefulness to God. I thank you, O Father, Lord of heaven and earth. And then, come to me, all you that labor and are heavy laden. Is not exactly followed with Matthew 12:1. At that time, Augustine indecisively said that it could just mean in the general sense of time. Not as I had spoken about Jairus while he was speaking these things. That's way too direct. It's way too connected. Here it's not connected as much. It's more vague. And if it's vague here in Matthew 12:1, which I looked up in the Greek is exactly the same intro to Matthew 11:25, then these verses from Matthew 11:25 to 30 could all be fit into Luke. Which is what I'm going to do.